Norris was rushed to a hospital in Hawaii where he lived on the island of Kauai with an undisclosed health emergency. Reports say he was in good spirits, even speaking on the phone. But then his health took a sudden and dramatic turn for the worse.
There is a moment that stopped the entire world. March 10th, 2026. Chuck Norris stands in the warm Hawaiian sun, laughing, sparring with a training partner, throwing punches with a kind of precision that would embarrass men half his age. He looks directly into the camera and says the words that would later feel like a cruel twist of fate. I don't age. I level up. I'm 86 today. 9 days later, he was gone. The man who the entire internet had collectively decided was immune to time, injury, and death itself, passed away suddenly on a quiet Thursday morning on the island of Kauai, Hawaii, surrounded only by the people he loved most. And the cause? His family requested privacy. No official explanation was ever given to the public. That silence has a particular weight to it. Because when a man spends 6 decades constructing the most indestructible public image in the history of action cinema, when the world agrees through a million jokes and memes that Chuck Norris doesn't get sick, he gives sickness a roundhouse kick. The absence of an explanation doesn't bring peace. It brings questions. And the deeper you look into the real story of this man's body, his career, his quietly kept health struggles, and the enormous physical price he paid across 86 years of relentless discipline, the more you begin to understand something that nobody around him was ever permitted to say out loud. The myth of invincibility always had a cost. It was just one that the world was never allowed to see. To understand what those final days in Kauai really meant, you have to go back much further than the movies. You have to go back to a shy, skinny boy named Carlos Ray Norris, born on March 10, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, a place so small that ambition itself felt like something that happened to other people in other places. Chuck would later describe his own childhood as downbeat. He was non-athletic, scholastically mediocre. His father, Ray D. Norris, was a World War II veteran who struggled deeply with alcohol, disappearing on drinking binges that stretched for months at a time. Young Carlos learned early how to make himself invisible. He developed what he later described as a debilitating introversion. He didn't fight. He hid. And that is the foundation upon which one of the most physically formidable human beings in the history of popular culture was eventually built. Not strength, not confidence, but the quiet and desperate need to become someone that fear could no longer reach. When he joined the United States Air Force in 1958 and was stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, everything changed. It was there, far from Oklahoma and the life he had been trying to escape, that he first encountered Tang Soo Do, a Korean martial arts discipline built on power, control, and the willingness to suffer through repetition until the body has no choice but to improve. Something in Chuck Norris clicked the moment he stepped onto that training floor. For the first time, pain was not something to hide from. Pain was a teacher. He earned his black belt, came home with a completely different relationship to his own body, and never really stopped training for the next 68 years. That number is the key to everything that follows. 68 years of martial arts training. High kicks, spinning movements, joint locks, impact absorption, full contact sparring, film stunt work, and the relentless physical demands of television production. The human body was not designed to absorb that volume and that variety of trauma without consequences. And the consequences, it turned out, had been building silently for a very long time. Here is the first disturbing detail that most of the people who knew Chuck Norris only through his movies and memes never knew. In July 2017, according to a report by Radar Online that resurfaced widely in the days after his death, Chuck Norris suffered not one, but 2 life-threatening heart attacks. The reported circumstances were alarming in every sense. A frantic 240-mile journey by ambulance and helicopter to reach the specialized care that ultimately kept him alive. 2 heart attacks, the same month, at 77 years old. And what did the world see of this? Almost nothing. He went quiet, recovered with the same private discipline that had defined his entire adult life. And by the following years, he was back posting fitness content, promoting his C-Force bottled water company, and encouraging his followers to stay active, stay committed, and stay grateful. The pain, as always, was private. The performance was always. But those 2017 heart attacks are not just a medical footnote. They are a window into a body that had been sending signals for years that the outside world was not being shown. Decades of extreme cardiovascular output during training. Decades of adrenaline surges during film fight sequences that were choreographed not for safety, but for authenticity. Chuck Norris famously performed the vast majority of his own stunts throughout his entire film career. No wires. No doubles for the high-velocity kicks, the close-contact combat, the falls. What audiences saw on screen was real in a way that very few action careers could claim, and that reality came with a physical cost that accumulated silently in arteries, in joint cartilage, in spinal discs, and in the walls of a heart that was asked to perform at extraordinary levels across an extraordinary span of time. When you study the documented long-term effects of elite-level martial arts training combined with decades of stunt performance, a consistent and sobering picture emerges. Joint degeneration in the knees, hips, and shoulders is nearly universal among fighters who maintain high-intensity training into advanced age. Spinal compression and chronic disc damage are common results of repeated high-impact kicks and ground contact over many years. Rib fractures, accumulated across a career, produce structural changes in the chest wall that don't heal back to original condition. And repeated head impacts, even those that fall below the threshold of a diagnosed concussion, add up in ways that researchers are only now beginning to document with the seriousness they deserve. Chuck Norris lived on the extreme end of every one of these categories. His co-stars over the decades frequently commented on the raw intensity he brought to fight choreography. There are documented stories of Bob Barker, the game show host who trained regularly with Norris, accidentally having ribs broken during a practice session. There are accounts of film extras nursing genuine bruises after Chuck's striking speed exceeded what anyone expected even from a rehearsal. And he held his stunt teams to those same standards, insisting that they train with the same intensity he demanded of himself. By the time Walker, Texas Ranger launched on CBS in 1993, Chuck Norris had already been fighting, in competition, in training, and on film, for over 30 years. The show ran until 2001, 8 seasons, 203 episodes, and he choreographed the martial arts sequences himself throughout the entire run, performing real techniques at real speed well into his 60s. Every spinning kick delivered at 60 years old carries entirely different risks than the same kick thrown at 30. The connective tissue is less elastic. The recovery window is longer. The accumulated micro-damage from thousands of repetitions has less time and less biological capacity to fully repair itself. None of this showed on screen. On screen, Chuck Norris looked exactly like what the myth required him to look like: timeless, powerful, and untouchable. Now consider what the final chapter actually looked like beneath the surface. Chuck Norris turned 86 on March 10, 2026, on Kauai, a place he had long loved and returned to as a kind of refuge. He posted a video that day showing himself sparring with a boxing trainer, laughing between combinations, looking genuinely strong and at ease. He wrote that he was grateful for another year, grateful for good health, grateful for the fans who had supported him across a lifetime. 9 days later, on March 18th, he was still on Kauai, still training. A friend spoke with him by phone that Wednesday and later described him as upbeat, in good spirits, cracking jokes. There was nothing in that conversation, according to everything reported afterward, to suggest that anything at all was wrong. Then the medical emergency arrived. And it arrived fast. According to TMZ, whatever happened occurred quickly. Chuck had been working out and was in good spirits, and then suddenly he was hospitalized. TMZ reports indicated he was taken to Wilcox Medical Center in Lihue, described as Kauai's main facility for acute care, with a note that higher-level treatment on the island could mean a transfer off to Oahu. Men's Journal by the morning of March 19, 2026. Chuck Norris was dead. His family confirmed the news in a statement posted to his official Instagram. It is with heavy hearts that our family shares the sudden passing of our beloved Chuck Norris yesterday morning. While we would like to keep the circumstances private, please know that he was surrounded by his family and was at peace. Kauai now. The word that kept appearing in every account released in those initial hours was sudden. Sudden hospitalization. Sudden passing. A man who had been joking on the phone fewer than 12 hours before he was rushed to a hospital. A man who had posted himself sparring less than 2 weeks before his death. His precise cause of death has not been publicly revealed, and his family chose privacy over details, deepening the sense of shock as the man who once seemed invincible slipped away quietly. Gazette direct in a mythology that had been built around him across 50 years of films, television, and internet legend. The word sudden was never supposed to apply to Chuck Norris. He was supposed to be the one who made sudden happen to other people. What makes the full picture so unsettling is not any single detail on its own. It is the combination. It is the 2017 heart attacks that were quietly survived and never made the centerpiece of a public conversation about mortality. It is the grief that concentrated in his final years. His mother passed away in 2024, and his first wife Diane Holchek died in December 2025, just 3 months before Chuck himself. Kauai Now grief is not merely emotional. It carries documented physiological consequences. Prolonged loss and stress are associated with elevated cardiovascular risk, hormonal disruption, and suppressed immune function, factors that carry enormous significance for a man in his mid-80s who already had a documented history of serious cardiac events. And yet, through all of that, the public face never changed. The posts kept coming. The sparring videos kept coming. The message never varied. Chuck Norris does not slow down. Chuck Norris does not look back. Chuck Norris levels up. The family's decision to keep the cause of death private is completely within their rights, and it is entirely consistent with who Chuck Norris was as a human being beneath the legend. He was, at his core, an intensely private man. The 700-acre Texas ranch, the aquifer, the bottled water company he co-founded with his wife Gina O'Kelly. These were pieces of a life built deliberately away from cameras and commentary. His marriage to Gina, whom he described in a November 2024 anniversary post as the most incredible woman God could have blessed him with, was the emotional center of his later decades. His 5 children, his 13 grandchildren, his faith community at Prestonwood Church. These were the real coordinates of his world. The family had always protected that world. Of course, they would protect the circumstances of his death with the same ferocity. But the silence does leave a particular kind of unresolved feeling for the people who followed Chuck Norris for decades. Because what the world is left with, in the absence of official autopsy findings or medical explanations, is the evidence written across a lifetime in flesh and bone. A cardiovascular system that survived 2 heart attacks and then continued powering intense physical activity for nearly 9 more years. A skeletal frame absorbing 68 years of high-impact training. A body asked repeatedly to perform at the level of a much younger man, because the mind that inhabited that body had decided, in some deep and irreversible way, that limitation was simply not an acceptable concept. There is something worth sitting with in that reality. The Chuck Norris facts, the internet meme that declared him immune to time, disease, injury, and death itself, were never purely jokes. They were a collective agreement that this particular man had done enough genuinely extraordinary things that the exaggeration felt like a reasonable extension of the truth rather than a departure from it. He had won real championships. He had performed real stunts. He had maintained real physical discipline across a span of decades that made other people's commitments look casual by comparison. The myth was built on something authentic. But the myth also had a shadow side, because it created a cultural story in which Chuck Norris did not have a body that kept receipts. And bodies always keep receipts. Every rib that cracked on a film set in the 1980s. Every joint compressed under the weight of a spinning kick repeated across thousands of training sessions. Every adrenaline surge that pushed the heart past comfortable limits during a stunt that nobody else on set would have attempted without a double. Every bout of grief absorbed and processed internally, away from cameras, consistent with a discipline that had been forged in a difficult childhood and refined across 8 decades of refusing to let the world see the cost. all of it written in tissue and cartilage and arterial walls, invisible to the fans, invisible to the followers, invisible to the internet that had collectively decided Chuck Norris was simply not the kind of man that mortality applied to. But it did apply. It always had. On the morning of March 19, 2026, on the island of Kauai, the man who had taught himself not to be afraid of pain, the shy boy from Oklahoma who had converted his fear into the most disciplined physical career in the history of American action cinema, reached the one limit that no amount of training, no quantity of discipline, and no depth of faith can permanently negotiate. He died. And because the details remain private, and because no public accounting of his final medical condition has been released, what we are left with is the outline of a story whose most important chapter was written not in any single dramatic moment, but across 6 decades of extraordinary, relentless, and ultimately irreversible physical effort. What Chuck Norris leaves behind is not a simple story. It is the story of a man who was genuinely afraid as a child and spent the rest of his life making sure fear could never reach him again. It is the story of a body pushed further, for longer, than almost any body in the modern era of action performance. It is the story of a man who survived 2 heart attacks, buried his mother, buried his first wife, and still showed up 9 days before his death to spar on camera and tell the world he was grateful for good health. That is not denial. That is something more complicated and more human than denial. That is a man who had made a decision about who he was going to be so long ago and so completely that the decision had become indistinguishable from the man himself. The internet's Chuck Norris cannot die. But the real one, the boy who hid from his father's anger in Ryan, Oklahoma, and grew up to spend 68 years learning how to stand in the middle of the storm without flinching, was mortal the whole time. He knew it. He just never considered it worth mentioning. And perhaps that is the most Chuck Norris thing of all. Even the final, undeniable truth of his own humanity, he kept to himself.